Welcome everyone to the Zoology Podcast for November. So in this podcast, I'm going to be talking about something that's quite near and dear to my heart, and that's animal welfare. This is an area of study in which I concerned myself with greatly during both of my degrees, and I'm going to try to explain to you in a freeform situation without using many notes or anything, just exactly why I believe this area of zoology is really relevant and poignant today, and how you actually go about proceeding to do an animal welfare study. So if you'd like to learn about this and how to do this, then please enjoy the episode. Okay, so what is animal welfare? Well, that's actually quite a contentious issue, because scientists argue greatly about exactly what animal welfare is. Well, I would say animal welfare regards itself with the state of an animal's life, in its ability to cope with its everyday occurrences, and how this impacts upon its health, both physical and mental. Okay, so why would we be even talking about animal welfare? Well, if you come from a Western country, you may think we have rather good standards of welfare. Our cats and our dogs, they're treated relatively well, that you take them to the vets when they're sick, you look after them, they're a member of your own family. But just think about all the animals you don't see. Think about all the farming animals that day to day go to slaughter. How many thousands of animals, cows, chicken, pigs, every day go to slaughter? You've got to think, what has their life been since they've been born, up to that moment, and during that moment? Now, even in, say, the United Kingdom, where I'm from, our standards are higher. They're one of the highest in all the world, in the whole of Europe. But unfortunately, you still get bad things happen. Like, you still get tail biting from pigs who have been put far too together, because when pigs are kept too close together to each other and they get stressed, one way to relieve that stress is you can take it out on someone else. Well, pigs do the exact same thing, and they tend to bite the tails of other pigs, but they can do this so much that they basically bite the other pig's tails off. It's absolutely horrible. Another way they redistribute this stress is by gnawing on metal bars, but obviously this messes their teeth and jaws up. So all of these are massive animal welfare issues. And this is one reason why we have to look at this. Let's keep going along with the slaughterhouse thing. So, you want to raise an animal, and you want to raise it so it can basically have a good quality of life, a good standard. And then when you raise it for whatever it's being used, say for food, you want the slaughter of that animal to be done as humanely as possible. Well, I would want it to be done as humanely as possible. Some people may not be, some people may not care, but I really do think it's an important issue. So in this country, I think one of these things, an interesting thing to bring up, is in this country we have exceptions in slaughter practices for different religious sects. So the way you're meant to slaughter an animal here, say a cow, they're meant to be stunned, and then they get a bolt to their brain. So everything after that, they basically can't feel, they're basically dead. But the stun is obviously meant to disorientate them. The aim is to reduce the amount of suffering. Well, some of these religious sects, say Islam and Judaism, well, they have exceptions to this, which means legally they don't have to do this. Now, it's good to know that many of them actually do, but not all of them, and not enough. So they can actually slaughter their animals in what, for the time when it was created, may have been much better than what it was doing. But nowadays, it's just plain barbarism. They don't have to stun them. They don't have to do anything. They can just slit their throats, let them drain out. Like, it's absolutely horrible. You know, I once watched a video of these slaughter practices. Ruined my entire day. I was annoyed for the entire day. I just couldn't shake it out of my head. So I don't really recommend, unless you've got a stern constitution, to actually seek out these videos, because they are harrowing. But anyway, why is it really important that these animals experience a good level of welfare? Well, the one is just the vast quantity. We have millions upon millions of chickens just in the UK that are just going to go to slaughter. There's also the issue of animals that we keep within captivity. So think about all the habitats that are currently getting destroyed right now, and all the animals that are suffering because of that. Well, many of these have to be taken out of the wild and put into captivity simply for their own survival, or just to remain as an arc species, so that in the chance that their habitat gets restored, that they can have something to go back to. Well, these animals need to be able to maintain a good level of welfare within captivity, not only so they can survive and reproduce, but so they can stay as wild as possible while in captivity. Luckily, as I was saying, in the UK, we've got a lot of legislation around animal welfare. We have the Animals Act, which is good. Oh, we have the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, which makes the UK, basically, that makes invasive scientific studies rather ethically strenuous on animals. Which is good, which is really good. But obviously, you can go to another country if you want to get around these regulations. You know, scientists tend to be quite mobile as it is. One of the big things that has been derived from UK legislation is what's known as the 5 freedoms. This is the freedom from thirst and hunger. This means that the animal has access to fresh water and has a varied enough diet to maintain good physical health. You then have the freedom from discomfort. This is the provision of biologically appropriate environments which have a comfortable resting area. Then you have the freedom from pain, injury and disease, which, putting it simply, means that it's the prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment of an animal's ill health. You then have the freedom to express normal behaviour. This basically requires a provision of abiotic and biotic elements, which will allow the animal to express whatever natural behaviour it needs to express to maintain a healthy psyche. And finally, you have freedom from fear and distress. Basically, it's what it sounds like. You have to provide an environment which avoids undue necessary mental suffering on part of the animal. So you have all of these things put into legislation that zoos and veterinary practices and farmyards, all these type of things have to abide by to maintain a good level of welfare. But obviously we can always get better, and we should always strive to do better. But you do have limitations. Not only do you have the physical and practical limitations, you have monetary limitations, and the better welfare standards you have to provide will tend to cost more money until we can figure out a way for it not to. You also then have the cultural standards. Now, luckily in the UK, we're a massive animal nation, and that's brilliant. We love our animals. So it's not hard to inform someone and say, look how badly these chickens are being kept. Chickens shouldn't be kept in cages this small. This was a big thing about, I think it must have been in the early 2000s, with caged chickens. And luckily because of this, people were so disgusted that now people really only want to buy free-range eggs and chickens, which is really good. So it's not a hard issue, but there are some people who obviously this doesn't get through. And that can be a massive issue, because when you're from a culture which doesn't view these animals in a high regard, people don't feel like they need to treat them in a high regard because of that. Think of it this way. How well do you think you need to treat an ant? I, personally, would say you shouldn't cause undue suffering to it. If I see an ant crawling on a sidewalk, I shouldn't just crush it. I shouldn't do that. The way I view it is, I don't gain anything. All I've caused is undue suffering on an animal. But here's the thing. Do ants even experience suffering? Well, it's hard to know, but I would think that, well, we come from the same evolutionary line, if you go far enough back, and I experience suffering. Therefore, I'm just going to assume they do, if you understand what I mean. But this is the thing. How much do you think you should put in consideration to the welfare of an ant? You know? When you can take yourself out of this and see that other people can view chickens or rats or cats or even dogs as much as you would put, say, a consideration to an ant, then you can understand just how and why people can treat animals so badly. But luckily, in the UK, we've been raising the floor for what moral consideration we have to animals and their welfare. And a big part of being able to do this is through what's known as animal welfare science. So this is what I was doing during my undergraduate and my master's degree, in part. So I'll just take you through what we studied in animal welfare science. Mostly you tend to study an animal's behaviour. So the big thing tends to be the occurrence of abnormal behaviours. These are known as stereotypies. A stereotypy is a behaviour that is done repetitively again and again, and it seems to have no apparent meaning. But it can be obviously detrimental to the animal's health. So things of stereotypies would be like pacing in one spot. Back and forward, back and forward, back and forward. You'll see a lot of zoo animals doing this. Some people try to argue that it's a form of coping with captivity, but obviously it can also be detrimental to them as well. Another form maybe you might see in birds is feather plucking. Birds will go along and they will pluck their feathers out, which will leave bare areas, or sometimes they'll pluck the feathers of other birds out. We already put on the tail biting of pigs, and there's an even horrible one in chickens where they try to bite basically the beaks of each other off, and like they debeak each other. It's absolutely terrifying. It's horrible. Don't look at any pictures that has it. I mean, or do. I'm not your boss, but I'd recommend not doing that. They are pretty gruesome. So these are one type of behaviours, but then you also have other behaviours that you may study. So you could just study locomotion. Simply, how much does the animal walk that isn't in a repetitive nature? How much of their enclosure do they make use of, for instance? That can be one thing you can study. You could also study vocal cords. Is there a lot of, say, chatter between monkeys? You could study mating and copulation. Are they copulating at a healthy rate? Is there perhaps too much copulation? Well, I'm not putting a human standard on it, but this is something you can study. The way you tend to get all the behaviours is you'll sit down and conduct what's called a pilot study. A pilot study is basically a study before the study in which you'll watch all the animals and you'll create something during the study called an ethogram. Now, an ethogram is basically a description of all the behaviours you have observed and then naming that behaviour and probably coding it. So you could have fighting as physical conflict between one individual and another, and you could code it, say, F1. Easy. So once you have done this, then over time you can use this ethogram to log the amount and occurrences of behaviours. So you can use various methods to do this. You could have a continuous recording sample, so say you don't want to be there because if you're there, your presence may impact on the behaviour of the animals you're studying. So you take yourself away from the situation and instead you leave a video recorder that's properly hidden. Now this video recorder obviously can record continuously. This is called continuous sampling. And in this you can time the exact amount of time a behaviour is exhibited for during the sampling period. You can also have interval sampling. So this is where you're only recording the behaviours during certain intervals. I've done this in the field studying rhinos before, where say every 30 seconds you're marking down what that animal was doing when you look, take 30 seconds off, look, mark down what they're doing, so on and so on and so on for how many hours you're studying them. You have various other things that use interval sampling, so you can have a 1-0 method, which is used to record occurrence or non-occurrence of specific behaviours. So you would say, simply mark, is this behaviour occurring with a 1? Is this behaviour not occurring with a 0? Pretty simple. Yeah, there's many different types. There's quite a full range of different ways to study animal behaviour. Apart from this, you can also study the physiology of the animal itself. You can look at basically general health. So how healthy does the animal appear to look? Is it losing hair? Is it underweight? Is it physically damaged in some way? Does it have lacerations or scabbing? Anything like that you can have a look at. You could even measure its heart rate. Or one thing that's becoming bigger and bigger now is measuring the stress levels of the animal. In mammals, you measure this through a hormone known as cortisol. And there's many ways you can do this. You can take a cortisol measuring from urine or feces. You can get it from the blood or even the saliva. And this is a really handy way of measuring it. But as most things in science, it can be quite nuanced because high cortisol, so high stress, doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for the animal. Males will get their cortisol shoot up when they're sexually aroused, for example, when they're trying to find a mate or copulate, their cortisol will rise. It's just a stress response. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Cortisol is one of the hormones that help you wake up in the morning. It doesn't necessarily mean you're very stressed in the morning. You may be very relaxed, but it will spike. Then again, cortisol will also rise when you are in a stressful environment. So it really depends how you're using this type of measurement to see if you can use it as a welfare indicator or not. Although, just an aside, an animal experiencing a high level of cortisol for an extended duration of time, that generally is a sign of poor welfare. Most animals don't have the capacity to deal with extended periods of high levels of cortisol. You can also use, say, with birds, eggshell quality. If the eggshell quality is high, so it's a good thickness or good robustity for the species you're studying, then that's good. If it's perhaps thin and brittle, then you've probably got a problem on your hands, but this is something that you can have a look through. Maybe you've got pesticides released or something, and you can find that out and hopefully improve it for the future. Another big thing that's becoming more and more used, especially in zoos, is thermal imaging. You can see, say, without disturbing an animal through a thermal camera, where its body's been injured. An injured area will tend to be hotter than the areas around it. So you can see it. And if there's no massive heat sinks, then obviously your animal is perhaps in better health. But obviously you don't tend to use this by itself. You still use visual health checks just to make sure, is the animal moving okay? Is it eating okay? Things like that. Okay, so let's just run through a mock study that we could do. So we're working in a zoo and we want to know how the introduction of a female capuchin into an already existing capuchin enclosure will affect the welfare of the animals there? Well, one way we can do this is look at the behaviours of the monkeys before and after the introduction. So you want to look at the behaviour before to get what is known as a baseline. So this is something that you can record without the new variable being put into the environment. Then after that, you obviously record the behaviours again, and then you compare. Super simple, super easy. So one of the ways we can do this is, say, not only just observing the behaviour, but you can also observe, say, the social proximity of the animals to each other. If you introduce this new female and you're using proximity, you can see which animals are getting closer or staying further away, and from that you can basically presume what the social dynamic within the social system were and what they are now becoming. And then once you've collected all this data, so the behavioural data, say the proximity data, you could even collect fecal data to measure cortisol. You do all this, and then in the end you can see how the dynamics have shifted over time. And from this you can make an inference in how the welfare of the animals themselves have shifted. So you may find out that by introducing this new female, you may get the males of the group to fight more. They may fight for her attention, to breed with her, or you may find out that by introducing her, you've caused a shift in the female relationships. Perhaps now there's, say, more grooming to cope with the presence of a newcomer. Or perhaps it's simply just more aggression, because now the newcomer is trying to find herself in, and maybe a lower ranked, I wouldn't like to use the word lower ranked, but you know what I mean. The lower ranked female is perhaps being pushed out even more. But then, once we know what's happening with this, and we know what welfare issues are present, you can then create a plan to mend these, to mitigate them. And this can be in the form of, say, removing an individual. I was once working for Paynton Zoo in Devon, and one of their gorillas, a gorilla named Pertinax, was basically being bullied by the other two gorillas. The gorilla was the bigger one. He was older and he was bigger, but the other two were ganging up on him and bullying him. So the end result was having to remove that gorilla from the enclosure. And sometimes this is just something you have to do. You know, it's better for the welfare of that animal that it is removed, even though it can have psychological issues, because especially if it's a social species like gorillas. But sometimes you have to make sacrifices. So you amend the social situation. You could, say, amend the dietary situation, or you could put in environmental enrichment. Now, environmental enrichment is kind of what it says. It's enriching the environment around an animal, but these tends to take the form of, say, food hidden in toys, or just toys themselves, say balls and things like that. Or it could be paper. Monkeys love ripping up paper for some reason. They like the destroyable aspect of the enrichment. You can have cognitive enrichment. So a lot of zoos actually they can use things like computers, so touch screens. The monkeys can play the games, and that's a form of cognitive enrichment. Or you could have visual enrichment, so you can have things that are shown from outside of the enclosure. Or you can have auditory enrichment. I know there was a study that used the sound of a hawk near, I think they were tamarins. Or was it vervet monkeys? But anyway, there was a hawk sound, and obviously it made all the monkeys look to the sky and look about. Obviously, this is a very good natural defensive behaviour that the monkeys obviously should learn, but it's not something they would normally encounter within the zoo. So this is another form of enrichment, even though it may obviously increase their stress. But overall, long term, a short stressful event like that may actually be beneficial, especially if they're going to be released into the wild. So yeah, there's obviously a lot of different things you can do. You could even use olfactory enrichment. Olfactory enrichment is smells. So you can place different rags that have been soaked in, say, citrus or perfume or human perfume. And you can leave it about the enclosure for them to find. And they'll sniff it out. And you then get the build-up of all the behaviours of them first noticing there's a smell and then them trying to figure out what is that. And then obviously the curiosity gets triggered and they start looking about and they eventually find it. And all of these type of things are good and can increase the welfare standards of captive animals. And yeah, that's pretty much it for animal welfare. You just need to be able to get enough data before and after something is done, and then try to figure out the state of the animal's welfare of what you're studying. As I said, this is actually an area of study that's really close to my heart, because I believe that we should be treating our captive animals as basically guardians. We are fully responsible for them. Because they're not responsible for themselves. They don't choose to put themselves in these situations. Nevertheless, they're going to be our companion animal or going to be a burger. They didn't choose this. So I always think that it's on our moral shoulders that we should deal with this burden. And because of that, we should give them the best welfare standards possible. Well, thank you for listening to this episode. I know it's a short one. Leave a comment or something. Tell me what you think of this more free-flowy, no notes thing. It's just off the top of my head. So I know it's a bit not as professional as I normally try to go for. But it's quite fun. It's interesting to do. A bit difficult because you don't really know where your brain's going to go. But entertaining nevertheless. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.